This is the most significant challenge to the command over power of Russian President Vladimir Putin. For the moment, it seems that there is a hiatus, but no one who tracks geopolitics thinks that this is where the story ends. So the critical question then for all our viewers on Newstrack becomes, where does this battle go next? Two battles now. The battle for survival for Vladimir Putin, whose authority has been questioned like never before, and more importantly, the war being fought between the Russian and the Ukrainian army and the impact it's having on the rest of the world. To talk about all these and more, I'm joined by a very fine set of analysts. I want to welcome first Ajay Malhotra, former Indian ambassador to Moscow. Welcome, Mr. Malhotra. Nandan Unikrishnan has spent his lifetime studying India-Russia relations, understands the ins and outs of politics in Russia very closely. Air Marshal P.K. Barbora has been the former Indian defense attaché in Moscow and therefore understands the capabilities of the Russian army and this war in Ukraine. For a perspective from Moscow, I'm joined by Tatiana Khukreva, journalist. She's been with us in the past, looking at what's happening in Russia and can probably explain the current situation in Moscow and elsewhere. I just want to go across to Solumia Boborovska, Member of Parliament of Ukraine, joining us on the Newstrack live from Kiev. So Solumia, welcome. We know that a Ukrainian counter-offensive has been underway for the last few weeks. It hadn't made much progress so far. From a Ukrainian perspective, as you and your country have been at the receiving end of this Russian offensive, what are you making of the current state of play where Vladimir Putin's authority has been questioned? He currently seems in control, but his command over power is definitely weaker than in the past. What does this mean from a Ukrainian perspective for you as a member of parliament in Ukraine?
So first of all, we see all the situation as being very internal Russian situation, and it even despite all Ukraine, the whole world was watching what's going on in Russia. But the point is that around 600,000 of Russian troops, soldiers, they are here in Ukraine, on Ukrainian soil and ground. That means we continue to fight, and nothing has changed to Ukraine. Despite Prigozhin was busy with his attempt to show something to Putin, his guys were fighting on the front line in Ukraine as well. So he didn't take them back from the front line. They stayed in Ukraine. He just mobilized the guys who were near him. But you are quite right. We see Putin has started to show his weaker side. He didn't expect. He was betrayed. But still, we haven't seen Prigozhin for 2 days. We don't know we know for sure the price of the word Putin's word that he promised Prigozhin to be alive. We still don't see Prigozhin anywhere. But I don't believe personally, and we don't believe in parliament in Ukraine as well. Wagner can be disappeared, but still, Wagner as a group, military private group, but still it can be appeared, Prigozhin private group, whatever. That's one of the obligatory and obvious tracks always Russian officials had in their property as their instrument. We can see the African states, we can see the Latin American states where Wagner group are operating, and they will be back in Ukraine because they can use the resource that which the Russian army cannot. But the question is not only for Ukraine, but for India, for Europe, for US as well. Where we are already, all our partners, allies, yes, except Ukraine, for the changing of Russia. Are we ready to see it defeated? Do we ready and are we ready to see Russia without Putin? What's next? What kind of Russia can be after Putin? I think these questions were lying and put on the table in different states, and probably in India as well. So that would be the main question: how to make this state again, not to provoke and not to invade and not to break the whole international rules.
Solomia Borovska, thank you very much for joining us from Kiev, Member of Parliament from Ukraine. giving a Ukrainian perspective on how this opens a window of opportunity for the Ukrainian forces to move faster and also weakens the control of Vladimir Putin. I want to go across to Moscow. Tatiana Khokreva joins us from there. Tatiana, that one question the whole world is asking, where is President Putin right now? And to what extent do you think his control over power, which so far was unquestioned and unquestionable, been weakened as a consequence of the actions of Yevgeny Prigozhin?
Well, look, first and foremost, I'd have to correct you a little bit. You call this a coup, an attempted coup, but nowhere in any of his addresses did Yevgeny Prigozhin say that he wanted to actually overthrow the government or the president. He never said that.
Sure.
So this whole rhetoric, being built on the fact that this is an actual coup against the power of the president is flawed and it's very base, which kind of gives us a lot of the answer that you're looking for. But in the meantime, the power of the president, being the person who actually solved this whole thing, he delegated the solution, he delegated the the talks that were held, and he did solve this. I don't think his image has been harmed whatsoever.
So do you want to tell us, what do you think is at play? Sure, you're right that Prigozhin didn't officially say that he was attempting a coup against Putin, but he was marching towards Moscow. The army came within 200 miles of Moscow. That by itself is unsettling. For all practical purposes, it seemed like an insurrection, but you're right that he didn't mention the word coup. What do you think then is at play? From the lens of Moscow, from your eyes as a reporter on the ground in Russia, what do you think is happening? Why do you think this happened?
Well, look, first and foremost, you say army. There was a column of, of cars. I would not necessarily call this an army. As you very well know, our actual army is nowhere near what the cars that were driving towards Moscow. From a point of view of a person who was in Moscow on Saturday, we were watching this, but you probably should have been in the city to understand the level at which it wasn't, it didn't look like an actual attempted coup to anybody who was here. I mean, people were out in the streets, doing sports, going to restaurants, surely worried about the images, but not as much so as, it has been portrayed everywhere outside of Russia.
Okay, so do you think that Vladimir Putin's control over power in Russia is weakened at all, or do you think he's still as unassailable as he was last week?
Weakened in what sense?
Weakened in the sense that he first said that there would be action against Prigozhin and those from the Wagner group who led this insurrection. He promised the sternest action and then agreed to an amnesty of sorts, had the Wagner group go, because they questioned Putin's authority. Putin is seen as a very strongman leader. He doesn't take to insurrections and people questioning his authority and isn't really known to be a forgiving man. So clearly he was under pressure, which is why he had to let Wagner group go towards Belarus. If this was the old Putin, he would have marched the Russian army, who didn't seem to fight Wagner, and taken them down. And by now, Prigozhin would have had to face the consequences of his actions, ma'am.
But also, this situation is not over yet.
I want to go across to Nandan Unikrishnan, who's tracked India-Russia relations for decades, distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, has innumerable contacts in Russia outside of what we are hearing from Moscow. In all your conversations and all your understanding of the power dynamic in Russia, Nandan, what's your sense of whether Putin has been weakened, and most importantly, where could the situation with the Wagner group and Prigozhin go from here?
Thank you, Rahul, for inviting me. I don't think President Putin's power has been weakened in any sense. I think this thing about the Russian army not taking on Prigozhin yesterday, there are some facts that we have to put on the ground, I think, before we start talking. Prigozhin has about 25,000 troops. he marched about 800 kilometers yesterday. So I don't think there was anything more than a few trucks. There are no tanks that could do 800 kilometers in 12 hours. So a few trucks may have been heading towards Moscow. Yes, there were a couple of skirmishes on the way, and he did bring down a few helicopters, which were unarmed, incidentally, surveillance aircraft. But nevertheless, I don't think that the Russian army that there was no action against him because the Russians were either supportive of him or they were afraid of him. I think no action was taken against him because the president wanted to resolve this without bloodshed. And he was hoping that at some point of time, Mr. Prigozhin, who clearly it was not expected what he did, because he met Mr. Putin 9 or 10 days ago. And both the chaps said they had a very productive meeting. So clearly, this was an unexpected development, and I don't think Putin or anybody expected Mr. Prigozhin to suddenly go off the edge like this. So overall, I think, in fact, at this point of time, Mr. Putin may actually have won out because he's seen as somebody who's resolved, as your commentary said, resolved a complicated situation without bloodshed. I don't think his authority in any sense has been undermined, because if you look at the front and where the war was being fought in Ukraine, Ukraine yesterday launched a few ferocious attacks. They did not gain any ground. The Russians responded with massive artillery fire and missiles. So the war was going on as it has been for the last couple of weeks. So there has been no effect there. The Wagner group was withdrawn from Ukraine on the 25th or 24th of May after the Bakhmut battle. So they were not fighting there. So clearly their not being there has not made any difference. The third thing that I'd like to point out is that it is only Yevgeny Prigozhin who's gone to Belarus. So you had a British lord talking about armed entourage around him and the danger that he presents. I think the man is lucky to go alive. And I would suspect that he is alive because of the intervention of the Belarus president. As far as the other troops are concerned, their contribution to the victory, as from a Russian perspective, is acknowledged. They have been allowed to go home. Those who did not participate in the action of Prigozhin on Saturday, and there are many of those also, have been asked if they want to have separate contracts with the defense ministry. So to sum it all up, I don't think Putin is weakened.
Okay. So Air Marshal Babora, Nandan Unnikrishnan says Putin isn't weakened, you're a military man. An insurrection against a sitting president. Those leading the insurrection are given amnesty. Nandan does understand Russia more than many, but maybe there are things happening in Russia which are different from how the assumptions that you'd bring to bear when looking at Russia ordinarily. What's your sense as a military man?
Look, let's be very honest and clear. And firstly, let's bring politics into it. Now, we all know that the battle for Ukraine has not been successful as far as the Russians are concerned. Why? You want to make war? Come on, then use strategy. For goodness sake, Putin was controlling the war by removing his generals one by one. Is that a way of fighting a war? Just because that general couldn't perform up to Putin's? And is Putin a strategist as far as war is concerned, warfare is concerned? I really have my doubts. The way you start removing your people who are in control of certain areas, you will not succeed. And then, more importantly, I feel that power has got to Putin's head. And anytime power goes to anyone's head, it's trouble. It's trouble, and that is what is happening in Moscow. That power has gone to... He's been removing generals, left, right, center. I don't think you can fight a battle like that. Now, next coming is he has.
No, so what do you
Putin
think
has
will
gone.
happen next,
Yeah.
Air Marshal Babura, given the fact that this insurrection for the time being has been controlled? We're seeing Prigozhin head towards Belarus. Putin is currently not in the public eye, but he's there somewhere. Do you think this then brings the focus back on this Russian counteroffensive, the Ukrainian counteroffensive and the Russian pushback? Or do you think this has weakened Putin in a way that was unimaginable till 10 days ago?
Yes, I think your second opinion is
Well,
correct.
first and foremost,
He's
again,
been.
we're talking about a counteroffensive, and even the Americans have already said that this counteroffensive is completely ineffective, that Ukraine has failed to gain any sort of ground during the events that happened on Saturday, which is clear indication of the fact that, A, the army is progressing. The Russian army is progressing. It doesn't matter if Wagner is fighting on the ground, is not fighting on the ground. We're actually gaining ground. We're gaining ground around Bakhmut, where, you know, as rightfully has been said, Wagner has not been fighting there for quite some time.
My question at Air Marshal Babura is whether this now, A, motivates the Ukrainians to fight harder, which is tough because they were already highly motivated, weakens the Russian army in a way that wouldn't have happened earlier. Their morale has been quite average because it's not as if they've been making rapid gains on the battlefield either. Air Marshal Babura, has this weakened President Putin or not? The voice from Moscow says no. Can I get Air Marshal Babura to respond to that? Yes, sir.
Yeah. You can't win a war in penny pockets. No, sorry. Your strategy has to be something that you have to cut off a whole chunk of land to be able to plan further strategies. Putin is not a strategist. Please understand. He is not a strategist. And if you're not a strategist, you can't make war. Not of the type that he has made, which unfortunately for him hasn't gone off well at all. As far as his own status is concerned, whatever little I know from my friends there is that he doesn't trust anyone. Putin doesn't trust anyone anymore. It's totally, I will do it. And this is where I personally feel he is in trouble. What kind of trouble, only time will tell, but he will be in great trouble because he will be fighting his own people.
Okay, Ajay Malhotra, you've been India's former ambassador to Moscow. Your sense of the power dynamics more from a political perspective, it seems the Russian defense minister could possibly be on the way out. That was one of Wagner's demands. There hasn't been any official confirmation so far, but that's one of the things that has been spoken about. From your understanding of the state of play in Moscow, is Putin's power indeed weakened or not?
Well, if you see, Putin has all along been handling the entire Ukraine crisis with kid gloves. He's not gone along and had this sort of devastatingly aggressive attacks. You started off with a small operation and proceeding with, as I said, with kid gloves. He may have initially looked weak in the present context, but he has quickly prevailed and sorted out the internal challenge. He's done so without major bloodshed and with the regular units and generals and the governors of the various districts on the way and the Russian opposition parties, none of them announced for Prigozhin. So it is a little, I think, off target to say that somehow a gentleman with 4,000 troops at his command at that particular moment may have had an insurrection which could have succeeded. Certainly it could have opened up the way and triggered off a dangerous internal conflict, because there are others who would like to stir and muddy the waters, given that Russia is in a war situation at the moment. But where will we progress from here? And you ask about Shoigu. You know, if you see Putin's dismissals, and here I don't agree with the previous speaker, he has been very careful in keeping on those who have been loyal to him. And Shoigu, if he removes him, he will sideline him gracefully. He has shown 3 decades loyalty. They are friends of long standing. He used to be in charge of the Emercom earlier. He's from Tuva. They are very, very close buddies. And he rarely abandons them. He will get another sinecure. If you see, there's nobody really in a power position whom Putin on sidelining has abandoned. You can see even the people in power. Foreign Minister Lavrov has been there for donkey's years. NSA Patrushin has also been there for a very long time. Even Medvedev, when he had to switch away from being president, has been given a sinecure, and I think the same will happen up here. There are certainly rumors, and that could be a part of the package that was agreed, by which Prigozhin agreed to go to Belarus. But let me up here point out, if he had not gone, unfortunately there would have been blood in the streets, maybe in Rostov, perhaps approaching Moscow. I don't think it would have reached Moscow. You have in the governor in Tula a very effective old aide of President Putin, Alexei Dumin. He's been the governor for a long time. He used to be the security in charge and aide to Vladimir Putin before, and was in charge of military special operation forces, which annexed Crimea in 2014. And if you see from the visuals, you had some of the Chechen forces arriving there, Ramzan Kadyrov's men, and occupying the bridge, and this is all shown through visuals. So a few trucks moving up and down, I didn't think would have amounted to much. And with nobody coming out in his favor, I think...
No, but what do you make of the reactions of the people on the way who were cheering the Wagner forces, coming out wanting to get selfies? It almost as if it seemed for that while they were marching towards Moscow, that people wanted Wagner to win and for Putin to lose, or at least those who were seen in all these videos and photos.
It depends which videos you're seeing. There's a lot of disinformation and misinformation being spread by both sides. And certainly the West, certainly by the Russians to project their viewpoint. But no, nothing of the kind. Did any of them join them? They posed for photos and for, it was more for photo ops, etc. Even in Rostov, if you see. So that is a bit of an exaggeration to say people said, well done. That well done might be for the previous very competent performance of the Wagner forces. And if you look at the situation on the Ukraine front, the Ukrainians couldn't take any advantage of the 2 days that they had to try and hit it. In fact, the Russian forces continued to defend, and the counter-offensive has got nowhere so far. That could change, but at the moment, I think the Russians in their defensive posture are very much in command. So with Putin back in position, much depends on what else happens now. And certainly there are Western intelligence and other groupings involved in trying to take advantage of the situation, and it is a war situation. Now, Russia against NATO, I agree with assessments that are put out there. It's not merely Russia against Ukraine. That war finished a long time ago. So let's see where that develops.
Nandan Krishnan, what do you think will happen next? Given the state of play at this moment, it's an uneasy truce of sorts. Will Wagner actually now sit out? Will Prigozhin actually now sit out the rest of the battle? Or do you think this truce is only temporary and there's bound to be another fissure, and we can't be certain where, when, how, but there's likely to be another eruption somewhere? You're on mute, Nandan. Unmute yourself.
I'm so sorry. First, let me address
Just unmute yourself, please.
Yeah, I've unmuted myself.
Hello?
Firstly, let me address the question of the cheering of Wagner troops by the citizens. The cheering is taking place after Wagner surrendered. These are all photo ops taking place after they have surrendered and pulled back. When they were going towards Moscow, you will not be able to find any of these pictures. So just a clarification. As far as Wagner is concerned, I think it's a legal question. If Prigozhin owned Wagner as a private entity, it will be disbanded. There is no other option that is there. But there is another question that is linked to Wagner. Wagner is involved in several countries outside Ukraine. It is involved in Syria, in Libya, in some African countries. Someone mentioned Sudan and Venezuela. They are definitely not involved there. But there are other countries they are involved in. The question is, how will the Russian state now deal with a few thousand armed Russians in these countries? Because these countries have employed Wagner to perform certain tasks. So somebody has to decide what is their legal status and how. So I have a suspicion that either a new military, private military outfit will be floated, or an older one which already exists will absorb these people and the operations will continue. Wagner as a force under Prigozhin is over. It probably won't be participating in the Ukraine war any further, except those who get their contracts renewed by the defense ministry. Those members of Wagner will be fighting in the war in Ukraine. Will there be another insurrection? I doubt it. You know, this is the problem with this one, Rahul. We cannot call it an insurrection or a coup. You know, as the Russian journalist pointed out, nowhere has Prigozhin said that he is anti-Putin. In fact, on the contrary, he has said during Saturday that he is willing to lay his life down for Putin. So, you know, it doesn't make sense what happened. You can't have an insurrection where you're saying that the chief of the state is the one you're willing to lay your life for. So, you know, there are a lot of unanswered questions, and if you will give me a minute, I basically think that Mr. Prigozhin went over the edge because his company was under threat, and his business was becoming quite difficult, and he was trying to attract the attention of the Russian state, of President Putin. They had a meeting 9-10 days ago. Unfortunately, his queries were not addressed in a manner that he would have liked to see, despite the fact that both sides they had productive meetings. And so he just went over the edge. I mean, I don't want to use stronger words, because the actions that Prigozhin indulged in on Saturday are not rational. They don't make any sense.
Okay, he's also a mercenary fighting a crazy war. Many of his people around him are dying. He's not happy with the kind of support he's getting from the Russian Defense Ministry. It is, make no mistake, a very volatile situation. Those who understand Russia deeply think that the matter is settled for the time being. But strange things have happened in world politics, and whether or not this matter stays settled is something we will track. But you've heard from the experts from Moscow, from India, who seem to think that for the moment Putin is in charge. I want to thank all our guests for joining us. The story had the whole world on edge, because it has consequences not just for Moscow and Kiev, it has consequences for the rest of the world, which is why it is important to feature this on the news track.